Hello, this is video 3 in our series of videos designed to help review us for the Interactions Unit exam. In this video we'll be talking about limiting factors in symbiosis. So recall that limiting factors would be anything that's going to limit the growth, abundance, or distribution of an organism in an ecosystem. So that might be a limiting factor such as sunlight in the rainforest or water in the desert, but we were focusing on learning about new limiting factors, in specific, nitrogen and phosphorus. When present, these two limiting factors can contribute to great growth in an organism, and when absent, the growth and abundance and all of that can be lessened and stunted. And so the simple explanation is that both nitrogen and phosphorus are needed to make DNA and RNA. And so without DNA and RNA, we wouldn't have the recipes for life. We couldn't replicate our DNA. But furthermore, we couldn't make ATP, the energy source, which helps us replicate our DNA or any of the other things that we do in life. So hopefully you can see that nitrogen and phosphorus are integral to the life of organisms. They really can't live without them, and so when they're in short supply, it's a problem. So we looked at the phosphorus cycle, and we learned from our video that most phosphorus is found in rocks in the environment. And so those rocks are weathered through erosion, and bits of rock through runoff will flow into a body of water, and they'll settle to the bottom, becoming part of the sediment. And then over large or vast periods of time, actually, they will in fact become new rocks, which will eventually be uplifted back to the surface, and the cycle will continue. Likewise, phosphorus flows through the ecosystem in the food chain. It starts with plants uptaking the phosphate from the soil, incorporating it into their tissues, and then consumers consuming the plant, thus transferring those same phosphorus groups into the snail. When the snail later dies and decomposes, decomposers will liberate that phosphate back into the soil so that it can be cycled again through the ecosystem and the food chain. Likewise, when the plant dies, it too will decompose, and that phosphate in the form of phosphorus will be liberated to the soil. Next, we went on to the nitrogen cycle. And we know nitrogen is equally important, as it helps us with DNA and RNA and also making proteins, which are essential to life. From our video, we learned that most nitrogen is locked up in the atmosphere. Triple covalent bonds in the form of atmospheric nitrogen, N2, abundant yet unusable to organisms. So there are organisms called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They live in the roots of special plants who have nodules, basically little condos for these bacteria. And these guys have a specific enzyme that will allow them to break the triple covalent bonds. The only other thing that can break this triple covalent bond between the atmospheric nitrogen is lightning. So here's how it goes. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is taken up by the plant, sent down to the roots, and here those bacteria with their enzymes break that triple bond, releasing nitrogen into the environment. Okay. The plant can take up that nitrogen as a fertilizer. Remember, we said most fertilizers are rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. So the plant takes up the nitrogen as a fertilizer, and the bacterium lives here, getting free food from the photosynthesis of the plant. And so as such, this is an example of mutualism. Both are benefiting from the relationship. We can also see that nitrogen is cycled through the food chain as this organism is feeding on a plant that is rich in nitrogen. As the animal goes to the restroom, its wastes are nitrogenous and they're released to the soil. So there's a source of nitrogen in the soil. As it dies, or even as its waste decompose, that nitrogen is it is converted into the ammonium ion, which is then changed into nitrite via the nitrifying bacteria in a process called nitrification. Those bacteria then do an extra step, converting nitrite to nitrate, or nitric acid, same thing. And finally, there's a group of bacteria called the denitrifying bacteria, which restore that nitrogen, that NO3, back to the original form of atmospheric nitrogen so that the cycle can continue. So again, nitrogen cycle, very, very important. And just to quickly review, the types of symbiosis, there's mutualism, where benefits flow both ways. There's parasitism, where one organism benefits by harming another. And then commensalism is when one organism benefits and the other one's not affected. So again, symbiosis, the interaction between two different organisms living in close association. Remember that we played a quick little nitrogen cycle game so you could become familiar with all the different locations of nitrogen in the ecosystem. So continuing on the nitrogen cycle, too much of anything is a bad thing. And so while nitrogen is essential and it's a good thing, too much of it can actually lead to negative consequences, such as eutrophication. When there's excessive nitrogen and or phosphorus in a body of water, this can result in something called dead zones, areas where there's great loss of animal life and oxygen depletion. And usually eutrophication is the result of runoff. So you might recognize a eutrophic body of water because it'll be green, have like a pond scum on it. Those are those algae in an algal bloom. And remember, with so many algae, they're the ones using up all the oxygen in cell respiration, and that's why the water becomes very deficient in oxygen for the animals. The algae are kind of a dominant species, like we saw in the gizmo activity. All the other species die off, and then the algae kind of dominate that ecosystem. So kind of a similar situation. So we looked at current locations of dead zones, and we said that as there's no oxygen and organisms die, we're going to see a decrease in biodiversity, perhaps even trophic cascades, and for sure disruption of food chains. So all prime examples of what could happen with a dead zone. And again, that results from excessive nutrients such as nitrogen or phosphorus getting into bodies of water. We reviewed rumen ecology, citing it as an example of a niche, as each of these different kinds of species has their own particular job, their own particular way of getting energy, their own role in the ecosystem. Each one of them is integral to the digestion of the cellulose fibers taken in by the cow. And so once again, another example of mutualism. As the cow is bringing the food in, these species are helping to digest it, and everyone is reaping the benefits, not only the microorganisms, but the cow itself. Last topic on this particular day was when we reviewed ecological succession, basically just the progression of changes in vegetation in an ecosystem over time, including an increase in biodiversity. So we watched a video on succession. We watched that volcanic video, and you were able to see how in primary succession, where there's fresh lava that's hardened, there is no soil. And so it's going to take a long time for the pioneer species such as lichens to come in and break down the rocks, to create soil. Once soil is abundant, we talked about airborne seeds and birds depositing seeds to start seeding the area with new species. And as we start to see new species come in one at a time and get replaced with larger and more dominant species, we're starting to see an increase in biodiversity. Finally, we hope we get to the climax community, which would be characterized by large trees, and so, the peak of biodiversity. It makes sense that some of these pioneer species, the hardy species, are going to be R-selected. They're living in very tough conditions, unstable environments, as we're talking about primary succession. So they've got to go for the gusto and try to reproduce as much as they can just to colonize that land. Our climax community is going to have more K-selected species because it's more stable. Remember that secondary succession typically occurs after a disturbance of some sort, fire or eruption or even clearing of land. And so it's going to be a faster process than primary because the soil is already there. And after the disturbance, typically the soil is very rich in nutrients. So it doesn't take as long for the plants to come back, for them to restore that biodiversity. And once again, we're hoping that the secondary succession leads to a climax community.